Have you ever walked into a room and felt the atmosphere shift, not because of anything you said, but simply because of how you looked at the people inside it? Have you ever felt like a walking X-ray machine, involuntarily scanning the souls of everyone you meet? Seeing their secrets, their insecurities, and their hidden agendas before they even speak a word? If you have, you likely know the strange isolation that comes with being an INFJ. You know the feeling of being in the world, but not entirely of it. Carl Jung, the father of analytical psychology, spent a lifetime studying the depths of the human psyche, and he identified a specific orientation of the mind. The introverted intuitive that fits the INFJ profile perfectly. He described this type not just as rare, but as fundamentally distinct from the herd. But there is a darker side to this distinction that we rarely discuss. We often talk about the INFJ as the empathetic counselor or the mystical guide, painting a picture of a benevolent, soft-spoken healer. While that is true, it is not the whole truth. There is a reason why you, if you identify with this type, often feel rejected or pushed aside by groups. There is a reason why people sometimes react to you with sudden, inexplicable defensiveness. The truth is, society doesn't just misunderstand you. Often society is subconsciously terrified of you. Civilization as we know it runs on a very specific fuel. It runs on polite fictions. It runs on what Jung called the persona, the mask we wear to make ourselves acceptable to the world. The persona is necessary. It greases the wheels of social interaction. It allows the banker to smile when he is angry. It allows the politician to shake hands with his rival. It allows the neighbor to say, "I'm fine," when his life is falling apart. Most people cling to their personas because they believe that the mask is who they truly are. They have merged with it. They protect it at all costs. And then you walk in. The first gift that terrifies society is your inability to believe in the mask. Jung noted that the introverted intuitive is directed inward toward the unconscious images, toward the archetypes. This means your primary mode of perceiving the world isn't looking at the surface. It is looking through the surface. When you interact with someone who is living a lie, even a small, polite, social lie, you don't just hear the words they are saying. You hear the silence between the words. You see the micro-expressions that contradict the smile. You feel the dissonance in their energy. You are a living mirror that reflects not the face they want to show the world, but the face they are trying to hide, even from themselves. To a person who has spent decades constructing a fortress of denial to protect their ego, your gaze feels like a violation. It feels dangerous. They can feel that you know, even if you never say a thing. This creates a primal anxiety in others. It is the fear of being found out. It is the fear of exposure. You become a threat to the stability of their illusion. This is why you might find that people who are fake manipulative or highly narcissistic tend to dislike you instantly, often without any logical cause. They aren't reacting to your behavior. They are reacting to your perception. They are terrified of the naked truth that you represent. This leads us directly into the second aspect of your nature that unsettles the collective status quo, your immunity to groupthink. Jung wrote extensively about the dangers of the collective. He argued that when individuals merge into a crowd, the level of consciousness drops. The group is emotional reactive and often tyrannical. Society demands conformity. It demands that you laugh at the jokes everyone else laughs at, that you get angry at the current enemy of the month, that you value the things the tribe values. But you have a gift that makes you a glitch in this matrix. You possess a high degree of cognitive independence. Because your intuition is introverted, it is subjective and detached from the external object. You don't look outward to decide what is true. You look inward to see if it resonates. This makes you nearly impossible to hypnotize. When a wave of hysteria sweeps through your workplace, your family, or your country, you are often the one standing still, looking around, asking, "Does this actually make sense?" This stillness is unnerving to the herd. In a world that demands constant enthusiastic participation in the collective drama, your silence is interpreted as judgment. And often it is. You are the child in the fable of the emperor's new clothes. While everyone else is busy praising the invisible fabric of social norms and trends, you are the one quietly realizing the emperor is naked. You don't even have to shout it. Your lack of applause is loud enough. Society fears this because society relies on consensus to validate its reality. If everyone agrees that a meaningless job is important or that a toxic tradition is necessary, then it feels true. By simply not participating, by withholding your energy, you create a crack in that consensus. You remind people that they have a choice, and for many who are sleepwalking through their lives, the reminder that they could wake up is not a gift. It is a nightmare. If you have ever felt the weight of this alienation, if you have ever felt like the only sober person at a drunken party, it is vital that you understand you are not broken. You are functioning exactly as nature intended. You are the counterbalance to the collective madness. We dive deep into these dynamics here regularly. So if you want to continue exploring the architecture of your own mind and find others who speak this same language, take a second to subscribe. It is a small action, but it is how we find each other in the noise. Now, consider the third gift, which is perhaps the most paradoxical and confusing for those around you, your capacity for the door slam. This phenomenon is often discussed in pop psychology, but through a Jungian lens, it takes on a deeper meaning. It is not just about cutting people off. It is an act of supreme psychic preservation. You are naturally designed to seek harmony. Your auxiliary function. Extroverted feeling makes you acutely aware of the emotional needs of others. You absorb their pain, you validate their feelings, and you often compromise your own comfort to keep the peace. For a long time, people view you as the nice one, the listener, the doormat. They mistake your empathy for weakness and your patience for limitless availability. Society loves this version of you because it is useful. It feeds the narcissists and comforts the broken. But they forget, or perhaps they never knew, that your empathy is a choice, not a compulsion. Behind that warmth lies the cold, hard steel of introverted thinking. When you realize that a connection is fundamentally exploitative, when you see that a person has no intention of growing or respecting the balance, a switch flips. The warmth evokes. The empathy retracts. You don't just get angry, you get indifferent. This shift from profound warmth to absolute icy detachment is terrifying to the average person. They cannot reconcile the two versions of you. They think, how can someone so kind be so cruel? But it isn't cruelty. It is the reassertion of boundaries that were violated for too long. Society is terrified of the door slam because it represents the ultimate loss of control. It is the moment the useful object becomes a sovereign subject. It is the moment you reclaim your energy. This terror stems from the fact that most relationships in society are transactional. They are based on a subtle exchange of utility. When you slam the door, you shatter the contract. You demonstrate that you do not need them to survive. In a codependent world, true independence is the most frightening trait of all. It reminds others of their own dependency. When you walk away and never look back, you force them to sit with the void you left behind, a void they expected you to fill forever. Furthermore, this detachment is linked to a fourth gift, your relationship with time. Jung described intuition as perception via the unconscious, which allows one to see around corners. You live in the future, while the rest of the world is obsessed with the immediate sensation, the pleasure of the moment, the quarterly earnings, the latest scandal. You are observing the trajectory. You see where the dominoes are falling long before the first one hits the ground. This prophetic nature is a heavy burden, and it is deeply unsettling to those who live entirely in the concrete present. How many times have you warned a friend about a bad partner, or predicted the failure of a business venture, or sensed a cultural shift years in advance, only to be dismissed as pessimistic or crazy? And then, when it happens exactly as you foresaw, you are rarely thanked. Instead, you are resented. Why? Because you are the Cassandra of the modern age. In Greek mythology, Cassandra was given the gift of prophecy, but the curse that no one would believe her. Society is terrified of your foresight because it requires them to change their behavior now to avoid a catastrophe later. Humans are creatures of inertia. We hate change. We prefer a comfortable lie today over a difficult truth tomorrow. When you point out the inevitable consequences of someone's actions, you are forcing them to confront their own responsibility. You are removing their ability to play the victim later. If you tell someone, if you keep doing X, Y will happen, and then Y happens, they can no longer say, I didn't know. You took away their innocence. You made them conscious. And as Jung famously said, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. Your foresight forces them to face their souls. It shines a light on the path they are walking, a path they would prefer to walk in the dark so they can deny where it leads. This connects deeply to the concept of the shadow. You don't just see the shadow in others, you force the shadow to manifest. Because you do not play the superficial social games, people project their own shadow onto you. If they are secretly selfish, they will accuse you of being selfish when you set a boundary. If they are secretly manipulative, they will call you manipulative when you see through their schemes. You become a lightning rod for the collective unconscious of the group. This brings us to the fifth and perhaps the most formidable gift of all, the one that truly cements the unease society feels in your presence, your role as the alchemical catalyst. In medieval alchemy, a subject Jung dedicated the latter part of his life to decoding. The goal was not merely to turn lead into gold, but to transmute the soul, to take the base, unrefined aspects of the human experience and refine them into something higher, something pure. Jung realized that INFJs are by nature human alchemists. You do not leave things as you find them. You do not leave people as you find them. Society is obsessed with stasis. It creates institutions, traditions, and small talk to maintain a sense of permanent equilibrium. The average person wants their life to be a straight, predictable line from birth to death. They want safety. They want the boat to stop rocking. But you are the storm that forces the boat to move. You possess an innate drive for transformation. When someone enters your orbit, whether it is a romantic partner, a friend, or even a workplace, you unconsciously demand growth from them. You see their potential so clearly, often more clearly than they see it themselves, and you hold up a mirror to that potential. At first, this feels like love. It feels like being seen. But as time goes on, that mirror becomes a demand. It becomes a silent pressure to evolve, to shed bad habits, to confront past traumas, to stop playing small. And this is where the terror sets in, because for someone to grow, their old self has to die. Jung taught that the ego fights for its survival with the ferocity of a drowning animal. When you ask someone to grow, you are essentially asking their current ego to commit suicide so that a better self can be born. You are the harbinger of that death. You are the catalyst that threatens their comfortable mediocrity. This is why people often pull you close, obsessed with your depth, and then suddenly push you away with violence or ghost you without explanation. They aren't running from you. They are running from the work you represent. They are running from the painful process of transmutation that your presence triggered within them. It is a confusing experience for the INFJ. You think, I only wanted to help them be their best. But you must understand that most people do not want to be their best. They want to be comfortable. By simply existing, you threaten that comfort. You are a walking reminder that there is more to life than the material surface. And for those who have built their entire identity on that surface, you are an existential threat. This catalytic nature is amplified by your dominant function. Introverted, intuitive, which craves meaning above all else. You cannot tolerate the superficial for long. You dissolve illusions. If a system is corrupt, you sense it. If a family dynamic is toxic, you refuse to play the role that keeps the sickness alive. You break the cycle. And the person who breaks the cycle is always the villain in the story of those who want the cycle to continue. Society functions on a delicate web of codependencies and unspoken agreements to ignore the elephant in the room. You are the one who points at the elephant. You are the glitch in the simulation, and while this makes you terrifying to the asleep, it makes you invaluable to the awakening. So where does this leave you? If you are an INFJ, you have likely spent a significant portion of your life trying to dim these lights. You have tried to wear the mask, to laugh at the unfunny jokes, to pretend you don't see the tragedy coming, to suppress the urge to slam the door. You have tried to be normal, but you have also realized that this mimicry leaves you exhausted, hollow, and depressed. The fear society feels toward you is not a sign that you are doing something wrong. It is a sign that you are doing something right. It is a metric of your power. A lighthouse does not apologize to the captain for revealing the jagged rocks. It stands firm so the ship doesn't crash. You are that lighthouse. The fact that the light hurts the eyes of those accustomed to the dark is not your problem to solve. Jung's concept of individuation. The process of becoming one's true self requires the integration of the shadow. It requires us to stop projecting our gold onto others. You must stop projecting your power onto a society that cannot understand it. You must stop waiting for permission to be deep, to be intense, to be too much. The world is currently in a crisis of meaning. We are drowning in information but starving for wisdom. The structures of the old world are cracking. In times of stability, the INFJ is an outcast. But in times of chaos, the INFJ is the guide. The very gifts that make you terrifying, your foresight, your truth-telling, your capacity for deep transformation, are exactly what the human collective needs desperately right now. Do not let their fear shrink you. Do not let their rejection make you bitter. The door slam is not just for them. It is for you to protect your sacred space so you can cultivate these gifts. The X-ray vision is not a curse. It is a tool to find the few who are ready to be seen. You are not made to fit into the machine. You are made to understand it, to dismantle it, and to help build something better in its place. The isolation you feel is the cost of admission to a higher level of consciousness. It is the price of the ticket. And looking at the alternative, a life of blissful, ignorant sleep, it is a price worth paying. If you have recognized yourself in this analysis, if you are tired of hiding the very best parts of who you are, then you have already taken the first step toward that integration. We are building a library of these insights here, a place for those who are ready to stop running from their own shadow. Make sure you are subscribed so you don't miss the next chapter. Carl Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." For you, that means accepting that you are a force of nature. You are the mirror, the prophet, and the alchemist. Let them be terrified. Let them be uncomfortable. Because eventually, when the storm comes, they will look for the one person who isn't afraid of the dark, and they will find you.
Jung once said that life begins at the edge of your comfort zone, but he never meant it as a motivational slogan. Why? Because Carl Jung discovered that a true spiritual awakening is not a gentle expansion of comfort, it is its annihilation. Awakening tears apart the illusions that keep you safe, dissolves the fragile walls you've built around your identity, and thrusts you into the abyss of the unknown. That is why spiritual awakening destroys comfort zones. It dismantles everything you thought you were to reveal something terrifyingly greater. Today, I'll take you inside that journey into Jung's revelations about the self, the shadow, and the terrible price of transformation. You'll see why the psyche resists awakening at all costs, why people cling to false identities, and why the very thing you fear most, the collapse of your comfort zone, contains the seed of your wholeness. When Jung worked with patients who appeared on the surface to be stable, successful, even happy, he noticed something unsettling. Beneath the polished persona, a deeper unease brewed, a hunger for something more, and a fear of exactly what that more might demand. Jung understood that awakening does not come in the form of blissful light, but rather in the form of disintegration. Comfort zones die because they are not made to last. They are temporary shelters, and spiritual fire burns them down. Imagine, for a moment, standing before a mirror. The reflection is neat, composed, acceptable to society. But the glass begins to crack, and behind it, another face stares back, raw, primal, unfamiliar. This is the shadow, the part of you long exiled to preserve peace. Awakening doesn't politely knock at the door of your comfort zone. It shatters the mirror. You are forced to face not only what you are, but what you've denied. Jung recounted cases where patients entered what he called the night sea journey, a descent into chaos that stripped them of every illusion. One man, a respected professor, came to Jung after dreams of drowning. He confessed that his entire life had been an intellectual fortress, but devoid of spirit. As Jung guided him deeper, the man admitted his terror of emotions, his estrangement from his own desires, his fear of vulnerability. His comfort zone had been his intellect. His awakening required its destruction. Only by surrendering to the flood in his dreams could he be reborn. And this is the paradox you face. You want awakening, but awakening will not preserve who you are now. It will not validate your comfort. It will dismantle it. Jung wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain. To awaken is to step willingly into the furnace, to allow the false gold of security to melt away so that true gold, the self, can emerge." But why is this destruction necessary? Because the ego is a cautious architect. It builds small rooms of safety identities, roles, habits, relationships, narratives. Each room is a fortress against the abyss. But the self, the totality of who you are, is vast, untamed, oceanic. The self demands expansion, and it cannot fit inside the ego's tiny chambers. So the walls must fall, comfort zones must collapse. You may already know this in your bones. That gnawing dissatisfaction when life feels too predictable. That anxiety when things are fine but lifeless. That quiet knowing that something inside you longs to burn. Awakening begins there in the restlessness you try to silence, in the dreams you dismiss as nonsense, in the emotions you push away because they threaten your stability. Jung compared this to alchemy. The alchemist's furnace was not for comfort, but for transformation. Lead had to be burned, dissolved, broken apart before gold could emerge. Likewise, your comfort zone is lead. Awakening is the fire. What emerges if you endure is the gold of individuation, the unbreakable wholeness of the self. But do not be deceived. The path is dangerous because it feels like death. Jung often warned that patients who entered this process without guidance could be overwhelmed, fragmented, even destroyed. He did not romanticize awakening. He knew it as a crucifixion of the ego. And yet, he also knew it as resurrection. And so, here you stand. With the same choice every seeker faces: cling to the comfort zone and remain half asleep, or enter the furnace and risk everything for the sake of becoming whole. The moment you choose awakening, the old world begins to dissolve around you. Jung described it as standing at the threshold of the unconscious, where the ground beneath your feet no longer feels solid. Friends may not understand. Family may resist. The life you once called normal begins to feel like a costume that no longer fits. What you are experiencing is not madness. It is the stripping away of the persona, the mask you've worn for survival. The persona was necessary. It allowed you to function in society, to be accepted, to belong. But as Jung warned, when the mask hardens, it becomes a prison. You forget that it is not your true face. Awakening rips the mask away, and in that moment, naked before the unknown, you are confronted with terror and possibility at once. For Jung, this moment was not abstract theory. He lived it. After his split with Freud, Jung entered his own abyss, a period of visions, dreams, and inner chaos he later chronicled in The Red Book. He wrote of descending into a cavern, of meeting figures who challenged him, of encountering the very gods and demons of his psyche. To many, it might have looked like madness, but Jung recognized it as initiation. He was living the destruction of his own comfort zone, and through it, the birth of his deepest insights. Now imagine yourself in his place. The ground of certainty falls away. You begin to dream of strange landscapes, to feel emotions that don't fit who you thought you were, to crave meaning beyond the routines of your daily life. You want to turn back, to cling to the old safety, but the current pulls you forward. This is the nature of awakening once begun. It cannot be undone. One of Jung's patients, a woman in her 30s, dreamt of standing in a burning house. Every room she tried to enter collapsed in flames. At first she believed the dream was a warning of disaster, but Jung explained that the fire was symbolic the destruction of the old rooms of her psyche. Her comfort zones were being incinerated so that she could no longer hide inside them. The dream was violent, but it was also liberating. For her, the fire marked the beginning of individuation. And here is the truth: most people avoid awakening is not about finding comfort. It is about finding authenticity. Comfort zones keep you safe from pain, but they also keep you safe from transformation. They numb you with predictability, but they suffocate your growth. To awaken is to be exiled from safety, and to discover that the exile is holy. But do not think this exile is permanent despair. Jung knew that within every descent lies a hidden ascent. The house burns, but from the ashes rises a structure truer to your soul. The persona crumbles, but from the fragments emerges a self that is no longer divided, no longer hiding. You feel it already, don't you? That pull toward a life that is not built from fear but from truth. Yet fear still clings to you. Jung warned that when the comfort zone collapses, the shadow rushes forward. All that you denied: anger, desire, grief, power surfaces. This is why awakening feels dangerous. It confronts you with the parts of yourself you swore you would never face. In those moments, you may dream of falling, of drowning, of wandering in a dark forest. These are not signs of failure. They are invitations. They show you that the psyche is guiding you deeper. Jung called this process active imagination, the dialogue with the unconscious. He encouraged patients to let the images speak, to let the shadow reveal itself, to listen to the wisdom hidden in the darkness. But make no mistake, to listen is to risk. Because once you hear the shadow's voice, you cannot pretend you never knew it. You begin to realize that the comfort you lost was never true peace. It was avoidance. Now the abyss demands your courage. And what of the modern seeker? You may not be sitting in Jung's study, but your crisis is no less real. Your comfort zone may be the career that drains your soul, the relationship that demands silence, the habits that anesthetize your longing. Awakening destroys these not out of cruelty, but because yourself cannot breathe inside them. You must choose: cling to the illusion, or step into the fire. And so the path begins. The persona falls. The shadow rises. The unconscious floods your waking life. It feels like death, but it is initiation. When the persona falls and the shadow rises, you are thrust into a crucible where every illusion of safety begins to melt. Jung warned that this is where many retreat in fear, clinging desperately to the remnants of their old world. But if you remain in the furnace, something extraordinary begins: the alchemy of transformation. The shadow is not your enemy. It is the repository of everything exiled, repressed, and denied. Within it lies not only your rage, envy, and fear, but also your forgotten vitality, your creativity, your capacity for love. Awakening destroys comfort zones because they cannot contain this wholeness. Comfort depends on fragments. The self demands the totality. Picture yourself walking through a dense forest at night. The path is gone, the trees close in, and the silence feels unbearable. Suddenly, your eyes adjust, and what seemed like suffocating darkness reveals hidden forms, roots glowing faintly, constellations above, the sound of water flowing nearby. This is what happens when you allow the shadow into awareness. The forest no longer feels like death, but like mystery. Jung's patient journals recount moments where dreams turned from nightmares into guides. One woman dreamt repeatedly of being chased by wolves. She awoke in terror, convinced it was a sign of danger. Jung asked her to imagine turning toward the wolves, to see them not as destroyers but as messengers. In her active imagination, she discovered the wolves led her to a cave filled with light. The predators of her psyche had become protectors once she faced them. This is the paradox of awakening. What feels like destruction becomes revelation. Your anger, once denied, becomes the fire that protects your boundaries. Your grief becomes the depth that makes love possible. Your fear becomes the compass pointing toward your next horizon. The comfort zone dies so that the shadow may rise, and the shadow rises so that the self may emerge. Jung described this emergence as individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are. Individuation is not comfort, it is confrontation. You confront your unlived life, the paths you avoided, the truths you silenced. But in this confrontation, you recover the fragments of your soul. You become more than the roles you play, more than the persona you crafted. You become a self that is whole, sovereign, and alive. Yet, individuation is not a single revelation. It is a series of deaths and rebirths. Each time you believe you have found solid ground, the unconscious shatters it again. Jung compared this to alchemical stages nigredo, the blackening, where the old self dissolves, albedo, the whitening, where clarity begins to dawn, rubedo, the reddening, where wholeness is embodied. Your comfort zones are burned in the nigredo so that the rubedo may shine through you. Modern life tempts you to resist this cycle. The world sells comfort as the ultimate goal: stable careers, predictable routines, constant distraction. But your psyche does not obey consumer culture. It will revolt. It will send you restless dreams, inexplicable anxiety, even symptoms of depression, not to destroy you, but to call you. Jung saw these symptoms not merely as illness, but as signals of a soul that refuses to remain asleep. And here is the cost if you ignore the call. Your comfort zone becomes a tomb. You live a half-life, repeating patterns, numbing your unrest, convincing yourself that survival is enough. But if you accept the destruction, if you step willingly into the crucible, you discover what Jung called the self, the vast center that holds both light and shadow, conscious and unconscious, human and divine. Awakening destroys comfort zones because the self cannot grow inside cages. The self is oceanic, and it demands to be lived. And you, yes, you listening now, feel that demand in your bones. You may have felt it as a quiet whisper, or as a storm that tore through your life. Either way, it is here. The fire has begun. The only question is whether you will run back to the ruins of your old world or step forward into the unknown, where your true life waits. As you step forward into the unknown, you begin to feel the cost of awakening in your body, your mind, your relationships. Jung wrote that the psyche is not polite. It does not dismantle your comfort zone in neat, manageable fragments. It tears at the roots of your attachments. People you thought would walk with you forever may fall away. Habits that once numbed your pain lose their grip. Careers, beliefs, even identities collapse like brittle scaffolding. You grieve them, even as you know they were never the essence of who you are. This grief is essential. Jung saw it as a form of initiation. To awaken is to die many small deaths, the death of who you thought you had to be, the death of the stories you clung to, the death of the shelter that once kept you safe. Comfort zones were coffins lined with velvet. Awakening rips the lid off, exposing you to light and storm alike. But what rises from these ashes, here the journey becomes both terrifying and luminous. Jung taught that the self communicates through symbols, dreams, synchronicities, archetypes. When the comfort zone is gone, the unconscious floods your life with images that guide you. You may dream of fire, water, serpents, or gods. You may notice uncanny patterns in the outer world that mirror your inner state. These are not coincidences. They are signs that your psyche is reweaving itself. One of Jung's patients dreamt of climbing a mountain, only to find the summit crumbling beneath her. She fell into an abyss, and there discovered a hidden temple, luminous and vast. To Jung, this was the essence of awakening. The mountain of the ego collapses, but the abyss reveals the sacred. The destruction of the comfort zone is not random, it is sacred architecture. And yet, you resist. Every human being resists. You will bargain with yourself, trying to salvage pieces of the old world, hoping you can awaken without losing too much. Jung warned against this. To cling to fragments is to remain divided. The self demands wholeness, not compromise. Comfort zones cannot be half broken. They must collapse fully, so that something entirely new can be born. At this stage, many people mistake the fire for punishment, but Jung saw it as alchemical necessity. In alchemy, the crucible must reach unbearable heat for the lead to transmute into gold. Too little fire, and nothing changes. Too much fire, and the vessel shatters. Awakening demands both surrender and resilience to endure the fire without fleeing but also without breaking. Here lies the danger. Jung often cautioned that awakening without grounding can lead to inflation when the ego, overwhelmed by the archetypal forces of the unconscious, begins to identify with them. The seeker mistakes visions for literal truth, power for divinity, self for godhood. This is why Jung called individuation a dangerous experiment. Comfort zones protect us not only from pain, but from grandeur. Once destroyed, the psyche must learn to hold the power of the self without being consumed by it. So how do you walk this razor's edge? Jung advised a balance to remain rooted in ordinary life while engaging deeply with the symbolic. To honor your dreams, your visions, your synchronicities, but also to continue eating, working, loving, and living in the world. The furnace burns within, but you still walk on the earth. In this balance, the self emerges not as chaos but as wholeness. Think of it this way: the comfort zone was a fragile shell. Awakening cracks it open, the yolk spills, the embryo stirs, and something larger than you begins to breathe. This is not the destruction of life, but the birth of life, more real than you ever imagined. And so, the destruction is complete. You are no longer who you were. The persona is shattered. The shadow has spoken. The unconscious has surged through you. What remains is raw, trembling, alive. You stand at the edge of something vast and holy, the self, waiting to be lived. And now, we arrive at the place where the old self is ash, and the new self waits to be born. This is the final stage of awakening integration. Jung understood that the collapse of comfort zones was never the end, but the gateway. The point was not endless destruction, it was rebirth into wholeness. Integration means gathering the fragments of your psyche, the persona, the shadow, the anima or animus, the archetypal images, and weaving them into a living tapestry. No part is denied. No part is excluded. The parts you once exiled return as allies. The anger that frightened you becomes strength. The grief that hollowed you becomes depth. The love you thought impossible becomes your very breath. But this integration is not passive. It is a choice you must live, daily. Jung wrote that individuation is a life's work. It is not achieved in a single revelation, but in the steady act of embodying your wholeness, even when it feels inconvenient, frightening, or misunderstood. To live awake is to live as the self, not as the mask. You may ask, what does this look like in the modern world? It means speaking truth when silence would be easier. It means choosing authenticity over approval. It means following the quiet compass of your dreams, even when society urges you toward conformity. It means seeing every relationship, every conflict, every joy and sorrow as mirrors of your inner process. Comfort zones will tempt you again, offering safety and numbness. But once you have tasted awakening, you know safety is not life. Jung saw this in patients who embraced individuation. A man once trapped in endless patterns of compliance began to discover his anger not as violence, but as vitality. He built boundaries, spoke with courage, and found relationships that honored his soul. A woman suffocated by duty began to honor her dreams, painting visions that spoke the language of her unconscious. Her comfort zone was gone, but her life had become a canvas of truth. You, too, are invited into this integration. When you honor your dreams instead of dismissing them, when you allow your shadow to teach you instead of terrify you, when you live not as a fragment but as a whole, you are living the self. And the self is not fragile. It is eternal, archetypal, radiant. This is why spiritual awakening destroys comfort zones, because comfort zones are too small for the immensity of who you are. The destruction was never the point. The point was to reveal the self. And so, as this journey closes, you stand at a threshold. Behind you, the ruins of your comfort zones. Before you, the vast expanse of a life aligned with truth. You have walked through the furnace, faced the shadow, endured the abyss. Now the self stands within you, waiting to be lived. If you choose it, your life will no longer be defined by fear, conformity, or survival. It will be defined by authenticity, creativity, and wholeness. And your awakening will not only serve you, it will ripple outward, igniting others. Because when one person lives as the self, it awakens the collective. If you feel this calling, type this in the comments as a living affirmation: I embrace the fire of awakening. Your courage to step beyond comfort serves not just your healing, but humanity's evolution. Thanks for watching. See you in the next dimension. Carl Jung discovered that what most people call awakening is not an ascent into clarity, but a descent into emptiness. He noticed that after spiritual breakthroughs, a staggering number of people, nearly 70% of those he observed, lost all motivation within months. Not because they had failed, but because they had succeeded too well at piercing through the veil of life's illusions. Jung called this paradoxical state the awakening paradox. It is the strange and unnerving moment when enlightenment feels less like liberation and more like exile, when the light of consciousness reveals not ecstasy, but vacancy, when the fire you thought would fuel your soul instead extinguishes every flame that once drove you. Perhaps you recognize the feeling. Lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering why nothing matters anymore. The goals that once sparked adrenaline now taste hollow. The old ambitions that propelled you forward now sit like empty shells scattered across the shore of your consciousness. You thought that awakening would ignite your life with unstoppable purpose, but instead it drained you of the very fuel that once kept you moving. The fire that once animated your existence has turned to smoke, and you are left inhaling the residue. But Jung insisted that this emptiness is not a failure. It is a psychological necessity. It is not the end of the journey, but a mysterious threshold. To confuse it with despair is to miss its hidden meaning, for in this void lies the embryo of authentic purpose, waiting in silence. He believed that spiritual awakening is not simply about revelation, but about annihilation. The annihilation of illusions, of inherited goals, of the fragile architecture of the ego. And though this collapse can feel catastrophic, it is the prerequisite for something deeper, more enduring, and profoundly more human. This emptiness Jung observed is part of what the ancient alchemists called the nigredo, the blackening, the stage of decomposition where everything familiar disintegrates, where the prima materia, the base material of the psyche, is reduced to formlessness. In modern terms, it is a psychological limbo, a suspension between what has died and what has not yet been born. You are too conscious to return to sleep, yet not awake enough to know how to live forward. The cost of misunderstanding this process is devastating. Most mistake it for spiritual depression. They believe they have taken a wrong turn, that they have lost their way, that they must claw back the motivations that once defined them. But Jung warned to return to old motivations after awakening is like trying to put a butterfly back into its cocoon. Not only is it impossible, it is a betrayal of evolution itself. And so you stand at a crossroads, but neither of the obvious paths will save you. To retreat into ego-driven ambition is to animate a corpse. To surrender permanently to emptiness is to petrify your soul in paralysis. Yet Jung uncovered a third path, one that does not deny the void, but walks through it with consciousness. To navigate the emptiness not as a mistake, but as an initiation. To recognize that the death of oneself is the precondition for the birth of another. To illustrate this paradox, Jung told the story of a woman named Maria. She had devoted her life to the pursuit of enlightenment through meditation, sacred texts, and relentless inner work. One day in the depths of meditation, Maria experienced what mystics call ego death. Her boundaries dissolved into pure, universal consciousness. For a time she was euphoric, ecstatic. She had touched the divine directly. She knew separation was an illusion. She knew that her fears, her anxieties, her worldly attachments, all of them were empty shadows against the blazing light of the Absolute. But then came the collapse. Weeks later, Maria could not get out of bed. She no longer cared to eat, work, or nurture relationships, not from sadness, but from indifference. She confessed to Jung, "I have seen the truth. Nothing matters. Goals are illusions. Achievements are ego games. Love is attachment. Work is distraction. I can no longer pretend that any of it has meaning." Her words strike like thunder, echoing the secret terror that lurks beneath awakening. The fear that seeing through illusions leaves nothing left worth living for. Jung recognized this not as failure, but as the sacred death phase of transformation. Maria had entered the nigredo, the chrysalis, where the caterpillar liquefies into formless goo, its old body dissolved into apparent nothingness. What looks like death is actually metamorphosis in disguise. But here lies the modern danger. Jung realized that spiritual practices can accelerate people into this state without preparing them to navigate it. Premature enlightenment, he called it, touching higher states of consciousness without the psychological container to integrate them. It is akin to opening the gates of heaven only to find yourself stranded homeless in your own psyche. Maria had awakened, yes, but she had no framework for living after the death of her old self. She was like a temple stripped of its statues. The structure remained, but the meaning was gone. Jung spent months working with Maria not to restore her old ambitions, but to help her recognize the sacredness of her emptiness. He showed her that she was not broken, she was becoming. He taught her to see the void not as a grave, but as fertile soil. For in alchemy, the blackening is always the beginning of the great work, not its end. And just as the seed must disintegrate in darkness before sprouting, so too must the psyche descend into the void before authentic purpose can emerge. What Jung discovered through Maria reshaped his entire understanding of psychology. Awakening, he saw, is not a promise of bliss, but a confrontation with death, the death of illusions, the death of ego, the death of borrowed meanings. And yet on the far side of that death lies something extraordinary, a form of motivation untouched by fear, untouched by social conditioning, untouched even by desire for recognition. A motivation that does not push or pull, but calls like a whisper from the depths of the soul. This is why the paradox of awakening is both terrifying and essential. To lose motivation is not a sign of failure, but of profound success. The ego is dead and the self is not yet born. And it is in this in-between, this crucible of emptiness, that individuation begins. Jung came to call this threshold the most dangerous moment of awakening, not because it was pathological, but because it was misunderstood. He observed that many, like Maria, fall into despair when the old scaffolding of ambition collapses, believing that they have lost their way. Yet Jung insisted this emptiness is sacred, necessary, archetypal. It is the descent into the underworld, the very same descent enacted in myth after myth, where heroes are stripped of their weapons, their names, even their light, before encountering rebirth. Odysseus wandering the land of shades, Christ entering the tomb, Inanna descending into the realm of darkness. Each of these images is not history, but psychology, clothed in story. For Jung, Maria's suffering was not her personal tragedy, it was a universal initiation. What she faced was not depression in the clinical sense, but the collective unconscious itself, calling her downward inward. The black sun of alchemy hidden behind the collapse of meaning. She had seen through the illusions of society, but she had not yet encountered the archetypal ground that gives birth to authentic life. It was not nothingness she faced. It was the raw material of transformation, chaos pregnant with potential. Jung's studies of alchemy provided him with the symbolic map he needed to guide patients like Maria. The nigredo, the blackening, was always the first stage, the burning away of false gold, the reduction of form into formlessness. But it was never the final stage. The alchemists promised that from this darkness, if endured consciously, comes the albedo, the whitening, the glimmer of new clarity. And beyond that, the rubedo, the reddening, the flowering of authentic life. But none of these could be rushed. The psyche, like nature, has its own timing. The seed cannot be forced to bloom by tearing open the soil. This is why Jung warned so urgently against returning to ego-driven goals after awakening. To cling to the old is to refuse the death that makes new life possible. He described it as trying to reanimate a corpse, mistaking motion for vitality. Many of his patients, terrified by emptiness, attempted to return to old careers, old ambitions, old roles. And though they could mimic the gestures, their souls withered inside. Because once you have seen through illusion, you cannot unknow it. You cannot unsee the emptiness of external validation. To attempt to live as before is to live in betrayal of your own consciousness. Jung's task with Maria, then, was to teach her to wait, to remain in the void without panic, to recognize it not as annihilation, but as gestation. This was the crucible of individuation, the moment when one sheds the persona, the mask we wear for society, and waits naked and uncertain for the self to emerge. And here Jung added his most radical insight that the self does not appear through striving, but through surrender. Through listening, through what he later called active imagination, a dialogue with the unconscious, where the soul speaks in symbols, dreams, and subtle impulses. But to understand how revolutionary this was, you must see it against the backdrop of culture. Jung lived in a world intoxicated by progress, ambition, the industrial drive to produce. To tell someone that their emptiness was sacred, that their paralysis was necessary, was to speak against the grain of an entire civilization. And yet he saw it again and again. Those who endured the void consciously emerged with a motivation that was utterly different from before. It was not person-driven, rooted in fear, conformity, or hunger for approval. It was self-driven, flowing from the depths of being itself. One of Jung's patients, a woman named Sarah, described the difference with crystalline precision. "I used to be motivated by anxiety," she told him. "Fear of failure, fear of rejection, fear of not being enough. That fear kept me moving, but it also kept me chained. After my awakening, that fear died, and for a time I thought I was broken. But slowly I began to notice other impulses. I wanted to create not to impress anyone, but because creating felt like breathing. I wanted to help people not to be praised, but because their suffering stirred something alive in me." This was the beginning of what Jung called soul-driven purpose. It does not arrive as fire and thunder. It arrives as whisper, as subtle inclination, as a gentle pull toward what feels alive. Ego-driven ambition demands you must. Soul-driven purpose invites you may. The former consumes energy, the latter generates it. Ego goals carry urgency. Soul impulses carry inevitability. And this is why so many miss it, because they are waiting for the old signals, the adrenaline rush of anxiety, the push of fear. But authentic purpose does not push. It calls. Yet Jung also knew that between the death of ego motivation and the birth of soul motivation, there is always the gap. This gap can last months, even years. And it is here that most people falter, reaching back for the corpse of their old life or sinking into permanent paralysis. But Jung urged, do not rush this. The psyche is reordering itself. Something ancient is at work within you. To interfere is to interrupt the mystery. To illustrate this paradox, Jung often drew upon myth. He likened this stage to Persephone's time in the underworld, or the 3 days Christ spent in the tomb. These stories echo through the collective unconscious, precisely because they symbolize this universal phase, the descent, the waiting, the silent darkness before resurrection. Every authentic rebirth is preceded by death. Every true self emerges only after the old self has dissolved. Jung called this the individuation paradox, that one must lose oneself completely before one can find oneself authentically. What we call loss of motivation is not collapse, it is initiation. It is the psyche's way of clearing out counterfeit drives so that something real can take root. So when Maria wept that nothing mattered, Jung did not try to convince her otherwise. He did not try to resurrect her ambitions or reinflate her goals. Instead, he sat with her in the silence of her chrysalis. He taught her to grieve her old self, to mourn her illusions, to honor what had once driven her, and then to release it. This act of conscious grieving, Jung found, accelerated the transformation. For when we resist loss, we freeze it in place. But when we surrender to loss, we become available for new life. And so Maria began to change not by force, but by listening. She noticed dreams stirring with images of children and forests. She dismissed them as fantasy, but Jung urged her to follow. Slowly, she began volunteering with environmental education. Not as a career, not as a strategy, but as a response to what called her from within. For the first time since her awakening, she felt alive. Her purpose was not imposed, it was discovered. Jung realized then that awakening was never meant to end in emptiness. It was meant to pass through emptiness so that the self could finally speak. And those who endured the blackening phase consciously emerged with a motivation not only unshakable, but inexhaustible. It was as though they had tapped into the current of life itself, no longer swimming against it, but flowing with it. This is why Jung insisted that awakening is not bliss, but crucifixion, not clarity, but confusion, not success, but crisis. Because only by dying to the false can one be born to the true. Only by surrendering to emptiness can one encounter the abundance of the soul. After working with patient after patient, Jung came to see that what people feared most, the emptiness after awakening, was not a barren wasteland, but a hidden threshold. He began to notice that all authentic transformation follows the rhythm of death and rebirth. The psyche, like the seasons, requires winter before spring. The withering of leaves is not a catastrophe. It is the necessary condition for new growth. And so too, when your goals, your ambitions, your borrowed purposes fall away, you are not being abandoned by life, you are being invited into its deeper mystery. Jung gave this process a name: individuation. It was the path by which a human being moves from the prison of persona-driven existence into the vast freedom of the self. Yet this movement is not linear. It demands the crossing of deserts, the wandering in liminality, the confrontation with what he called the shadow, the parts of yourself that had been rejected, hidden, or buried. For when the illusions of ego collapse, what surfaces first is often the darkness. You have avoided your fear, your loneliness, your suppressed anger, your unclaimed desires. These rise like ghosts, demanding recognition. This is why so many mistake awakening for failure. Because the light you touch first exposes the shadows you have never faced. And yet Jung knew that to repress them again is to halt the process. To descend into them consciously is to discover the raw material of your true being. The shadow, paradoxically, is not the enemy of the self, it is its womb. Consider Thomas, one of Jung's patients. For 15 years, Thomas built a thriving business, convinced that he was driven by passion for entrepreneurship. But after a sudden awakening, the scaffolding collapsed. He confessed to Jung every late night, every sacrifice, every strategy. It wasn't passion. It was terror. Terror of being a failure. Terror of being insignificant. Now that I see it, the whole enterprise feels like a house of cards. His motivation had evaporated, but what was revealed beneath was the shadow of inadequacy he had tried to outpace his entire life. Jung named this condition purpose poisoning. So much of what we call purpose, he argued, is nothing more than sophisticated ego defense, striving for success to mask inadequacy, pursuing love to escape loneliness, chasing achievement to silence the fear of being unworthy. The tragedy is not that these pursuits fail, but that they succeed only to reveal upon their achievement the same emptiness that birthed them. Thomas had won the game only to discover it was the wrong game entirely. But here is the revelation Jung offered. The loss of ego-driven motivation is not the death of purpose, but its purification. When counterfeit desires are stripped away, what remains is possibility untainted by fear. And though this void feels unbearable, it is the compost of the soul. Out of it, authentic impulses arise tender, subtle, but indestructible. Jung likened this to alchemy's threefold process: dissolution, coagulation, integration. Dissolution, the old self, crumbles into ash. Coagulation, new symbols, new desires begin to form like constellations in the night sky. Integration. These impulses are woven into a life no longer driven by fear, but called forth by soul. Each stage is essential. To resist dissolution is to cling to illusion. To force coagulation is to produce false idols. To skip integration is to lose the gift of rebirth. One patient, Sarah, described the shift this way: I used to be driven by scarcity. Every achievement was a shield against fear, but when that shield shattered, I thought I was lost. Slowly, though, I began to notice something different. I wanted to write not for recognition, but because words carried life in me. I wanted to tend to others, not for approval, but because their pain felt like mine. It didn't feel like motivation. It felt like remembering. This remembering is what Jung called soul calling. Unlike ambition, which demands and drives, soul calling whispers and invites. It does not roar, it hums. And yet it is infinitely more sustainable because it is not fueled by lack but by abundance. It does not drain, it animates. To live from soul calling requires what Jung described as conscious waiting. This is the hardest discipline: to sit in purposelessness without panic, to abstain from filling the void with counterfeit goals, to trust that the psyche, like nature, ripens in its own time. He compared it to fasting, not from food, but from motivation itself. A motivational fast, he called it, clearing the psychic body of poisons so that the subtle taste of authentic desire might be discerned. But waiting is not passive. It is a form of listening. It is an apprenticeship to silence where you begin to hear impulses too quiet to register beneath the noise of fear. And when they appear, they do not come with fanfare. They arrive as images in dreams, as synchronicities that nudge, as inexplicable fascinations that tug at the edges of your day. Jung urged his patients to trust these signals even before they made sense, for the soul does not argue, it calls. Jung's genius was to see that what appears as emptiness is actually pregnancy. The void is not a barren absence, it is a gestational space. Something is forming unseen in the depths of the psyche, and the longer one can remain faithful to the process, the stronger and more authentic the new self becomes. Thus, the paradox becomes clear. Awakening strips you bare, not to punish you, but to prepare you. The fire that extinguishes your old motivations is the same fire that forges your authentic ones. The crisis is not the end of meaning, it is the end of false meaning, so that true meaning can finally emerge. Jung's great discovery was that the void between the death of the old self and the birth of the new is not a place to escape, but a place to inhabit. He called it a psychological crucible, and he compared it to the ancient initiatory rites in which young men and women were symbolically killed before being reborn into adulthood. In those rituals, participants were stripped of names, clothing roles, and protections. They were lowered into darkness, cut off from society, until they no longer recognized themselves. Then and only then were they brought back into the community as something new, no longer children, but beings marked by transformation. Jung believed that the psyche performs this same initiation in the wake of spiritual awakening. This is why he insisted that losing motivation is not a personal error, but a universal archetype. The collective unconscious carries within it the patterns of death and rebirth, the descent and the ascent, the crucifixion and the resurrection. What you are experiencing is not unique to you. It is the same pattern that has played out in myth, ritual, and story for millennia. The moment when everything familiar dies is the same moment that everything real begins to gestate. But there is a danger here if you refuse the initiation. If you attempt to resurrect the corpse of your old motivations, you will live as a ghost within your own life. Jung warned of this with unflinching clarity. He saw patients who, unable to endure the emptiness, forced themselves back into careers, relationships, and ambitions that no longer fit. Outwardly they succeeded, inwardly they rotted. Their souls withered under the weight of the masquerade. They became, as Jung wrote, spiritually dead while still alive. The challenge then is to remain faithful to the void, to wait in the chrysalis, to accept the dissolution of everything you thought you were. Jung knew that this is terrifying because the ego experiences death as annihilation, but the self experiences death as transformation. It is only the mask that dies. What remains is essence. Jung developed a practice for this waiting sacred grieving. He asked patients to write letters to their old ambitions, to thank them for the energy they once provided, and then to release them. "I grieve the part of me that wanted to be famous," one patient wrote. "That desire gave me vitality for years, but now I see it was born of hunger for attention. I honor what it gave me, but I let it go." This act of conscious mourning clears the psyche of attachments that no longer serve, creating space for the new to emerge. The second practice Jung offered was active imagination. He taught patients to sit quietly and ask, "What wants to be born through me?" Then to allow whatever images, words, or sensations arose from the unconscious to speak without censorship. For one patient, it was the image of a forest and children playing. She dismissed it as fantasy, but Jung urged her to follow. Soon she found herself drawn to environmental education, where she discovered a vitality she thought was lost forever. This was not a strategic career move. It was not motivated by fear. It was the unconscious revealing its authentic impulse. The third practice was what Jung called symbolic living. He asked his patients to stop forcing their lives into rigid plans and instead to pay attention to symbols, synchronicities, and fascinations, to notice what called to them with subtle but persistent energy, to follow curiosity instead of obligation, to live as though life itself were an oracle, whispering through coincidences, dreams, and intuitions. Those who lived this way often found themselves accomplishing more than ever, but without exhaustion. Because they were no longer pushing against life, they were flowing with it. This threefold process, grieving, imagining, and living symbolically, formed what Jung described as the psychological resurrection. It is the passage from ego-driven ambition to soul-driven purpose. It is the crossing of the desert, the rising from the tomb, and it is the only path by which authentic motivation can be born. But Jung also recognized that this process could not be rushed. The psyche unfolds like nature in seasons. Soul motivation is seasonal, not constant. It comes in waves like tides. To demand it on command is to exhaust yourself in futility. He warned against what he called spiritual bypassing, pretending to be motivated, manufacturing enthusiasm, while the soul is still in dissolution. Such pretense only prolongs the void. Better to be honest, to sit in emptiness, to trust that what is real will emerge in its own time. This was Jung's radical message to a culture obsessed with productivity, that doing nothing faithfully consciously could be the most sacred work of all. That waiting is not laziness but initiation. That emptiness is not failure but pregnancy. In a society where worth is measured by output, to trust the invisible work of the soul is an act of rebellion. And yet those who endured discovered something extraordinary. They began to notice impulses that felt entirely different from anything they had known before. These impulses were not urgent, anxious, or driven. They were calm, magnetic, inevitable. They did not say, "I have to." They said, "I get to." They did not arise from scarcity. They arose from abundance. Jung realized then that authentic purpose does not feel like traditional motivation at all. It feels like remembering, like discovering what has always been inside you, waiting for recognition. It feels less like ambition and more like homecoming. Jung eventually concluded that what most people call purpose is in truth a camouflage for fear. He observed with unsettling precision that 90% of human striving is a defense mechanism, an unconscious attempt to silence inadequacy, to escape loneliness, to avoid insignificance. Careers, relationships, achievements, all too often are elaborate constructions built upon foundations of fear. And he warned that when awakening strips these foundations bare, you see the architecture of your life for what it really was: a house of cards erected against the winds of existential terror. This is why the emptiness after awakening feels so catastrophic. It is not only the death of motivation, but the exposure of its roots. You suddenly realize that what you thought was passion was anxiety in disguise. What you thought was love was fear of abandonment. What you thought was ambition was terror of being unworthy. The revelation is merciless. You were never pursuing success for its own sake. You were chasing safety, recognition, and love through masks and mirages. Jung called this purpose poisoning. It is the great disease of the modern psyche, mistaking ego desires for soul desires, confusing survival strategies for authentic calling. He documented countless cases of individuals who achieved everything they thought they wanted, only to collapse into despair upon realizing it meant nothing. Their goals had been sophisticated, self-deceptions, elaborate rituals to protect fragile egos from pain. Yet Jung saw in this collapse not ruin but redemption. For when false purposes dissolve, the possibility of true purpose appears. This is the paradox of the void. What feels like death is actually liberation. When your counterfeit ambitions vanish, you are finally free to listen for impulses that come not from fear, but from being itself. He developed what he called purpose archaeology, a process of excavating the authentic calling buried beneath layers of social conditioning and unconscious defenses. It begins with desire discrimination. Jung taught his patients to examine every goal they thought they wanted and ask, "What is the because clause ego desires always carry one? I want to succeed because then I'll be respected. I want to marry because I fear being alone. I want wealth because I fear poverty." Soul desires, by contrast, stand without justification. I want to create. I want to explore. I want to love. They need no external rationale because they arise from fullness, not lack. This was radical in a society trained to justify every desire in terms of productivity, morality, or status. But Jung insisted that soul desires do not require explanation. They are expressions of being, not strategies for survival. He called them ontological desires, impulses that emerge from what you are not, from what you lack. One of his patients, David, provided a perfect example. Before his awakening, David pursued law out of fear. Fear of financial instability, fear of disappointing his parents, fear of insignificance. After awakening, all motivation for law evaporated. For months, he wandered in purposelessness, convinced he was broken. But then slowly, he began to notice a different kind of impulse, a longing to be in nature, not for any career or achievement, but simply because it felt like home. On his long walks, ideas for environmental projects would arise unbidden. It doesn't feel like motivation, he told Jung. It feels like remembering something I always knew. Jung recognized in this the essence of authentic calling. It does not thunder. It whispers. It does not compel. It invites. It does not arise from the head, but from the heart and body. Soul motivation feels less like striving and more like being moved. It is a current that carries you rather than a treadmill that exhausts you. But here Jung offered a stern warning: you cannot force this calling to appear. The ego, hungry for control, always tries to manufacture purpose. But authentic purpose emerges only in the soil of patience. It is born of conscious waiting, of enduring emptiness, without rushing to fill it. He urged his patients resist the urge to resurrect old goals, resist the temptation to fabricate new ones. Let the silence gestate. Let the unconscious do its work. Jung often compared this stage to pregnancy. The mother does not force the child into being. She carries it in trust, knowing that life is forming in its own rhythm. So too, the psyche, when stripped of ego's illusions, carries something new and unknown in its depths. The void is not barren, it is womb. And when the child is finally born, when the soul's calling surfaces into consciousness, it feels utterly different from anything ego ever knew. It feels effortless. It feels inevitable. It feels like water flowing downhill, requiring effort, but never strain work, but never depletion. This is why Jung insisted that authentic purpose cannot be figured out, it can only be lived into. It is not discovered by thought, but revealed through participation. You must follow the small impulses, trust the symbols, honor the synchronicities, and only after you live them will their meaning become clear. In this way, the void becomes initiation. The emptiness becomes fullness. The death becomes resurrection. The motivation that returns after awakening is not the old fire of fear, but the quiet radiance of being, and it is indestructible because it arises not from what you want to prove, but from what you already are. The deeper Jung explored this paradox, the more he understood that authentic purpose is less about what you do than about how you are. He saw that ego-driven motivation always wears the mask of urgency. I must achieve this, or I will not be enough. I must gain that, or I will be rejected. It drives the individual like a whip, pushing them endlessly toward mirages. By contrast, soul motivation is calm, magnetic, inevitable. It feels not like I have to, but like I get to. It arises not from compulsion, but from invitation. He began to see that this difference could be felt in the body. Ego motivation tightens the muscles, contracts. The breath floods the mind with pressure. Soul motivation warms the chest, steadies the breath, and feels like an expansion into aliveness. This subtle difference is easy to miss, especially in a culture that prizes anxiety as proof of productivity. But Jung urged his patients to become somatic philosophers, listening to the wisdom of the body as a compass for authenticity. One of his most illuminating case studies was a woman named Elena. Before her awakening, Elena was a successful marketing executive climbing the ladder of recognition. She told Jung that every campaign, every late night at the office was secretly driven by the fear of irrelevance. Her success fed her bank account, but starved her soul. After her awakening, she lost all interest in corporate ambitions and spent 2 years wandering in purposelessness. She described it as being dissolved into fog. Yet within this fog, she began painting again, something she had not touched since childhood. At first, it was private, done on weekends, without any plan to exhibit or sell. But she noticed that when she painted, she felt oxygen return to her soul. Over time, her paintings began to attract others who found in them an uncanny power to heal grief. Elena realized with tears that her true calling was not to sell products, but to create beauty as medicine for the human heart. I'm not building an art career, she told Jung. I'm simply allowing what wants to come through me to find its way into the world. This was the essence of what Jung called incarnated purpose. It is not something you invent, but something that wants to live through you. You are not the architect of your purpose, you are its vessel. And when you align with it, your life begins to flow with a sense of inevitability, as though you are no longer living for yourself alone, but for something greater that expresses itself through you. Jung noticed three characteristics in those who lived from this deeper alignment. First, they worked from overflow, not depletion. Their efforts did not drain them because they were not pushing against themselves. Instead, their natural enthusiasm carried them forward like wind in a sail. Second, they responded rather than initiated. Instead of forcing opportunities, they cultivated what Jung called synchronistic awareness, the sensitivity to notice meaningful coincidences and invitations from life. Third, they served something larger without losing themselves. Their work benefited others, but not through martyrdom or self-sacrifice. It was simply the overflow of authentic expression. Jung warned, however, that this path is not for the faint of heart. To live from soul purpose requires what he called the sacrifice of the golden ego. This is the painful relinquishment of external validation of wealth status, recognition as measures of worth. Soul purpose often leads you away from conventional success, and this can invite misunderstanding, even ridicule from others. Yet Jung found those who accepted this sacrifice gained something immeasurably greater: unshakable vitality, sustainable meaning, and a life aligned with the inexhaustible source of their authentic nature. He compared this transformation to alchemical rubedo, the reddening, the final stage of integration when gold emerges from the furnace of dissolution. Just as alchemists believed that true gold was not mere metal, but a symbol of perfected wholeness, so too Jung saw that authentic purpose was not about external achievement, but about inner alignment. To embody your purpose is to become gold, not in the eyes of the world, but in the depths of your being. Jung understood that people who live from this place radiate a subtle energy. Their presence itself becomes catalytic. They may not seek to change the world, but the world changes in their presence. Their authenticity liberates others because it signals that it is possible to live beyond fear, beyond pretense, beyond masks. He once wrote, "The greatest gift we can offer the world is the person we have become." For Jung, this was not metaphor, it was psychological law. And so he urged his patients, and us by extension, to trust the void, to trust the silence, to trust that what feels like emptiness is actually the gestational darkness from which authentic purpose emerges. He warned that the ego will panic, will demand answers, will beg to resurrect the old scaffolding of goals and ambitions. But he counseled patience. For the life that wants to live through you cannot be forced, it can only be received. This was Jung's radical reimagining of motivation, that it is not a fuel you generate, but a river you align with. You do not push it, it carries you. And the only way to find it is to let go of everything that is not it, even if that means wandering through deserts of meaninglessness. For it is in those deserts that the hidden springs appear. In the final years of his work, Jung crystallized his ultimate insight about awakening and the strange emptiness it births. What feels like the loss of motivation is not an absence at all, but a presence so pure that the ego cannot recognize it. He called it soul motivation, the life that wants to live through you. Unlike ego-driven striving, which shouts and demands, soul motivation arrives like a quiet inevitability. It does not push, it draws. It does not strain, it flows. It feels less like invention and more like remembering. But this kind of motivation terrifies the modern mind because it cannot be controlled. Ego motivation thrives on planning, strategizing, measuring. Soul motivation resists all of these. It moves in cycles like seasons. It appears in waves and synchronicities and mysterious fascinations that make no rational sense. Jung called this the symbolic life, a way of being guided not by rigid goals, but by symbols, dreams, and subtle callings. To live symbolically is to read existence itself as scripture, to treat coincidences as whispers of destiny, to walk as if life were conspiring with you instead of against you. One patient, after months of purposelessness, confessed to Jung that she felt suddenly drawn to study astronomy. Not as a career, not even as a hobby with a clear outcome, simply because the stars called her. At first she dismissed it as random distraction, but Jung urged her to follow the impulse without demanding justification. Years later she became a teacher whose passion for the cosmos awakened wonder in countless children. Her calling was not astronomy itself, it was the transmission of awe. The stars were only the symbol through which the soul whispered. This is why Jung emphasized the necessity of motivational fasting, a period of abstaining from forcing purpose, so that these subtler signals can be perceived. The void after awakening is not a punishment, but a clearing, a silence wide enough to hear the authentic voice of the self. If you rush to fill it with counterfeit goals, you miss the only voice that matters. When the soul finally speaks, its impulses feel strangely different. They do not originate in fear or in lack, but in abundance. They do not ask, "What must I do to be loved?" They declare, "This is what I love to do." They do not beg, "What must I achieve to be worthy?" They whisper, "I am worthy, therefore I create." This shift is nothing less than ontological. You move from a life of compensation to a life of expression, from being driven by what you are not to being animated by what you are. Jung saw that those who entered this state of alignment often described their lives as being lived through them. They felt less like authors of destiny and more like instruments of a larger music. And yet, this was not a surrender of responsibility, but a deepening of it. For when you live as an instrument of the self, your authenticity naturally serves the collective. Just as the river does not try to irrigate the land, yet nourishes it as it flows, so too the soul, when expressed, nourishes others without calculation. He called this incarnated purpose, when the invisible essence of your being finds expression in the visible world. It is not a career, not a mission statement, not even a passion. It is the alignment of essence with existence, of soul with form. Elena painting. David tending to the earth. Maria guiding children in nature. None of them chose these paths in the egoic sense. They allowed themselves to be chosen. But Jung warned against romanticizing this journey. To live from soul purpose requires courage, because it often leads away from conventional metrics of success. You may earn less, you may lose status. You may confuse those who expect you to play the old roles. He called this the sacrifice of the golden ego, the willingness to release external validation in order to remain faithful to inner truth. It is not an easy sacrifice, but it is the only one that yields inexhaustible vitality. The paradox Jung discovered is that when you finally align with this deeper current, life ceases to feel like a struggle. Motivation no longer requires effort. It becomes as natural as water flowing downhill, as inevitable as spring following winter. You do not force yourself to live authentically. You are compelled by authenticity itself. And in this alignment, your very existence becomes medicine. You serve not by trying to serve, but by being wholly yourself. This was Jung's final gift to us, the reassurance that the emptiness after awakening is not your enemy. It is your initiation. The loss of false motivation is not the death of purpose. It is the birth pangs of a purpose so real that the ego cannot even imagine it. The void you fear is not barren. It is pregnant. The silence you dread is not absence. It is gestation. Something ancient, something eternal, something uniquely yours is waiting to be born. Your assignment then is simple, though not easy. Practice conscious waiting. Each day, ask without demand, "What wants to emerge through me?" And then listen, without judgment, without urgency, without panic. Trust that your soul knows what it is doing, even when your mind cannot comprehend. Remember, the awakening did not kill your motivation. It killed your limitations. The fire you lost was the fire of fear. What remains is the ember of eternity waiting for your breath. Trust the process, for what is dying in you is illusion, and what is being born is life itself.